Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I've got starting the new year with Grape to Glass, which is our virtual tasting. If you're new and you have not been to Grape to Glass before and you want to introduce yourself in the chat box, I'd love to say hi to you. There are some faces that I don't know and some names that I don't know that I see, so that's super exciting. I love having new people on to enjoy this experience, which really is meant to be a virtual wine tasting with a winemaker in Napa Valley, but from your couch. So kind of exciting to connect with all of you across the country. I know it's getting late on the East Coast, but perfect time for a glass of wine. We're kicking off our new year with two wines from Mari's Picks. If you're not familiar with what Mari's Picks are, those are our wine club selections that I work with our team to select each quarter. So we have 6 wines each quarter, and we take those wines and do a virtual tasting of 2 each month. So we're going to kick off the new year with Riesling and our Napa Valley Merlot today, which I'm super excited about. I don't know if everybody's familiar with Riesling. If you've been with One Hope for a while, you've definitely tasted the Dot Collection California Riesling, and you've probably tasted a Monterey Riesling before. They're wines that do really well in our space of wine, and I will admit to you that I know the least about Riesling than almost any other varietal. Everywhere I have worked has been diverse and a lot of different types of wines, but I've never worked in Germany. And this is a wine that's really all about Germany. The closest I've come to really making Riesling was in New Zealand when I worked on the South Island, which is very cold, an area called Central Otago, and that area grew really exceptional Riesling. So we're going to dive into this wine and learn a lot about it, and I'm going to be completely open and honest with the fact that you're always learning something, because there's no way you can know everything about wine. I learn new things about different wines all the time. One thing I know I love about Riesling is Riesling and Thai food. And when I go out to eat, a lot of times I look for a Riesling. It can be confusing because you're really not sure if it's going to be sweet and how sweet. And so to communicate with the wine director or your server, your bartender, whoever it is out to talk about like how sweet and whether or not you're going to like it can be confusing. So a lot of times people just steer away from Riesling. They think it's going to be too sweet, or they select a Riesling that's actually quite dry. And so a couple things to note is there are a wide variation of different types of Riesling made, even within Germany, and also within our One Hope portfolio. So the Riesling that we make from Monterey is a little bit drier with more acidity than our California Riesling. It's probably a little more true to typical style because it's grown in a very, very cool climate in Monterey County. And so some of us love to go on vacations in mountains and ski and play in the snow or hike. Some of us prefer to go to beaches to relax. And grape varietals are the same. They have preferences for different types of weather that they want to grow well in. And this is one that loves a cool climate, like is found in Germany. Parts of Canada, the Okanagan Valley is actually an emerging wine region, and Riesling is grown there. It's grown in New Zealand, like I mentioned, and then also in cooler parts of California, and scattered around many other places as well. But like I was mentioning, this is a German staple, and it's known for its ability to have that swing in either sweetness or dryness. Sometimes you find a producer that you really love. I know one of the restaurants I go to and frequent, that's a Thai restaurant. I know that they list their Rieslings from driest, they have several, and they list their Rieslings from dry to sweet. So I can pick based on how hot my food is. So if I'm going to have really, really spicy food, I want a little more sweetness. That sugary sweetness balances out the flavor. If I'm going to have, a little bit more full-bodied, I'm going to say drier food, that's not the word, less spicy food, then I'm probably going to pick something that has a little bit higher acidity. So this wine is most notable for having these intense aromatic bouquets, which are from the wine grape itself. There's a lot of floral characteristic, a lot of fruit, and that's what really drives this wine. So we have several aromatic whites in our portfolio. We have Riesling, we have Gewürztraminer, we have so many different other wines, and actually variations of those. The Muscat and the Moscato are also aromatic whites. So really pleasing to the senses because we're using so much of our olfactory and sense of smell to enjoy wine. These wines are really pleasing to a wide range of people for that reason. They smell delicious. Like if you were going to go to a flower garden and smell something wonderful like flowers, these are these wines. So over half of the world's Riesling vineyards are planted in Germany. It is definitely a German wine. That's where its foundation and base was from. And I think this is kind of a fun fact too, that Riesling was popular with the nobility in the Middle Ages. And so sometimes it was held in cellars where it could age for decades because nobody else was really allowed to taste it. And people started noticing that what we call sort of the terpene and petrol aromas really characterized the wine and made it noble as it aged. So if there was one wine that people recommend, a white wine, that people recommend aging, they always talk about Riesling. Now, it's not really common in American culture to age wines, period, and especially aging white wines, so we don't hear about it a lot. But Riesling is going to change in the bottle a lot, and it depends on how you like your wine. But if you want something that's a little less upfront, fruity, and floral, and kind of more interesting, we call it kind of terpene. It gets almost like a lemon oil character to it as it ages. And this would be a great wine to do that with. So if you're considering a little aging of any of your wines, putting some away, this is a great one to try. I know I tasted a 2015 Monterey Riesling that we had at One Hope, and I had not tasted it. I tasted it last year, and it was really, really good. So this will age well. It'll be really interesting and could be a really fun wine to pop out for Thanksgiving in a couple years or just for a special occasion, definitely paired with food. And I recommend, ethnic foods, spicy foods, that kind of range. Also, you can note the color. I poured a little bit here in my glass. This is also diverse in terms of sometimes it's very clear, and as it ages, it's going to get more darker yellow. Okay, so as it ages in the bottle, it doesn't mean it's gone bad, but the color is going to change. You also see variations of this depending on how much skin time a particular winery might have had during the pressing and making of the wine. This one is a really pretty color. It's just a little off of transparent. It's just kind of got a pale yellow color. It's really nice. But I am expecting it to pick up color over time. So we're talking about the general characteristics and flavor of Riesling, and we have all these really beautiful blossoms and also a fresh apricot and citrus zest. So we'll taste this together. This is definitely on the sweeter side of our spectrum, although not as sweet as our Muscat and not as sweet as our California Riesling. The acidity is soft, so it's not overly acidic, and the body is just right around medium body with that sweetness adding to the intensity and richness of the body. So I like to just smell this wine for a while. Already, I think this wine is picking up some interesting characteristics in bottle. This was just bottled last spring, sort of late spring, early summer, and it's starting to get some of the citrus zest, like the oil on the citrus zest in the aromas. So really pronounced different aromas. And you can almost get what we call that petrol. Does anybody kind of get that petrol character? There's just a little bit there. It's a little lift. It's not going to remind you of the gasoline in your car, but it might remind you of something like that, like lantern oil, something that's a little bit more subtle. That's considered a characteristic in Riesling that is actually very, very coveted. So this is actually a good thing. So when somebody goes, whoa, this smells like, wow, this smells like lantern or, gasoline or petrol, that's actually a good thing in the Riesling world. People like that. And people who like to see their Rieslings age like to see that, as well as that apricot character getting more pronounced and rich. One really fun thing about this wine, if I had 6 bottles of this wine and I started pulling them out maybe quarterly or half a year, just to see how they're doing and writing notes, this would probably be one of the most interesting wines to do that with, because as much as that petrol for me is coming out now, in a few months from now, that might go away and more apricot would come out. So when we start talking about these wines that are in our reserve portfolio and our iconic collection, they don't stay the same. They change in the bottle. And before we release a wine, oftentimes winemakers say, oh, this is going through like just a non-expressive phase. They can go like this, where they're super expressive and they're not as expressive, and they're super expressive, or they have a note here that's high and they have more fruit in 6 months. In general, fruit always declines with aging. But in Riesling, you're going to see that kind of pop up in sort of an uneven way through aging. So it's not as linear as other wines. Does that make sense? So yeah, so smelling this right now, I do get the kind of beginnings of that petrol, but I also get a lot of really pretty flowers and more of the apricot and zest than I'm getting of the floral notes than I got 6 months ago. 6 months ago, it was all about flowers. And it was like, is this going to be interesting enough? And it's kind of taking that interesting dive. Tasting this wine is a totally different subject, right? It's a totally different wine. When people say, oh, it doesn't taste like it smells, that's a real thing, right? And it's because we're still smelling those same things, but now the acidity has come into play. It's actually not as soft. It's really kind of coming out in the wine. The citrus zest, I think, is really pronounced in the palate. So we're probably tasting a little bit of that acidity, and we're expecting it to be sweet because that's what we think Riesling is, and it's a little drier than we're expecting, right? Is anybody else experiencing that too? Yeah. I always think, oh, something's going to be sweet. And then when it's not as sweet as I thought, it's like, oh, okay, well, I have to change the way that I think about that. I really love that wine, and it would be great with food. So you know what I like this wine with? I could have it with Thai food forever. I always order this with Thai food. So Thai salads are great. Chinese chicken is great, even if you want to do a spicy or you want to do more of like an orange chicken. I think this wine would really hold up to that too, that ooey gooey kind of sweet flavors. I also think this spring you could do this with a pasta primavera with a pea, fresh peas. Fresh peas are kind of that earthy character that I think would complement some of the petrol aromas, and you'd end up bringing out more of the lemon and more of the floral because they'd be working complementary to each other. And then for fun, if I was doing a baby shower or a fun like ladies brunch or some kind of tasting, in the afternoon, evening, I think a lemon lavender sugar cookie would be really nice with this wine. It would really accentuate the lavender and also that citrus note in the wine. So sometimes, even though it's sort of abstract, the lavender is kind of an earthy flavor, it would kind of complement that petrol. And then you know what happens when you pair two things that are different, you get the other one that's pronounced. So if you have earthy flavors, they bring out in your food, it brings out the fruit and the wine. If you have fruit flavors in your food, it brings out the earthiness in the wine. So I think that would be a really fun match. The lemon lavender sugar cookies would probably bring a little bit of each of those things out in the wine, and you'd have a really interesting wine, which is our goal when we're doing food and wine pairing. So I'm going to go to the chat box and see if anybody has any questions about Riesling. I know it's kind of a tricky grape to talk about, so if there's anything that didn't really make sense about it, or anything else that you want to learn about it, just go ahead and pop your comments into the chat box and we can discuss those things. Hi, Tracy. I see Tracy Cox joined. I'm going to see you soon. I see a couple other people that I don't see their names, and some of them I don't see your faces. But hey, everybody, welcome. And we're just talking about Riesling. Anyway, this is the perfect wine, I think, for winter food and spring. So we're going to be going from winter to spring. So even fondue, and then as you kind of go into your spring wine pairings and brunches and kind of fun gatherings, that's why I picked this wine for this quarter. I think pairing this wine with fondue would just make me feel like I was in the Alps somewhere, doing all the right things. Drinking delicious wine and having fondue is super duper fun. Awesome. Well, great to see you guys in the chat box. Hi, and I'm glad that you guys are having fun. Let's move to the next wine, which is Napa Valley Merlot. And this is the 2015. I remember the first time I tasted our One Hope Napa Valley Merlot was the 2014 vintage. And I was on the wine train with the Founding Leader Retreat almost 2 years ago. And it just made me feel like, oh, I'll never forget the flavor. It was over-delivering. It was really round and supple. The tannins were really chocolatey and pretty. It was like melted chocolate. And I was sitting on the wine train. I didn't know anybody, and I felt like so welcomed and comforted by this wine. I was like, oh, I'm in the right spot. This is a great wine. So sometimes you just have those places that you connect with a wine and you remember. Merlot is an awesome grape. It's really underappreciated now, all because of one silly little movie that we've all heard of and seen. And that's too bad. But the good news is there are some really great Merlots out there that are great values. And it certainly is one of my favorite reds to drink. And I'm not ashamed to say that because it is so balanced. So believe it or not, Merlot is the third leading red wine varietal in sales, following Cabernet Sauvignon and red blends in the United States. So Cabernet Sauvignon has always been king, but Merlot was right up there. And then we started seeing this new sort of expression of red blends come about and gain popularity. But the truth is that red blends are usually composed, a large percentage is Merlot, and that's for a great reason, because it's delicious. Merlot actually comes from the Bordeaux region of France, where a lot of people consider it this less intimidating red, right? It doesn't age as long as Cabernet Sauvignon because it doesn't have the weight and tannin expression. So tannins help a wine age. That's why Cabernet has decades and decades worth of noteworthy aging. But Merlot doesn't have that same cachet. It's not as big, it's not as bold, but it's really, really round and supple and rich. And I love this one, and I'm excited for us to taste it together. However, it is used in blends, like I mentioned, in red blends to soften those blends. So when you have some sharp tannins, obtuse tannins, maybe big weighted tannins, Merlot kind of comes in to smooth out those edges. And so we find that it's really enjoyable on its own. And fun fact here is that California Merlot even earned the title of Wine of the Year from Wine Spectator magazine in 2017. So one fun thing, I know a lot of you have trips planned to Napa or aspire to have a trip out to Napa. And I encourage you when you are traveling around to maybe seek out a few Merlots. You're going to find Cabernet everywhere. You won't find Merlot everywhere. And it's always a pleasant surprise because it's kind of this wine that winemakers really enjoy making, but people aren't talking all about all the time. And it still gets the same effort in the vineyard and in the winery and can be really, really interesting. So I'm going to swirl this wine. Now, lately I've noticed, especially at the estate, we have our wine in cellar, and here at home I have wine in my cellar, which is like an underground area. I call it my cellar because it sounds fancy, but it's really just like underneath my house, you know. But it's cold. You know, it's cool temperature, and that's where wine ages best. But then when you bring it out and you really want to appreciate some of these characteristics we're going to be talking about, you want it to warm up. So I've been using my hands a lot on my goblet. I've been using stemless glassware a lot more this winter to kind of warm my wine up, because even though you take it out of the cellar, it might need more than 10 or 15 or 20 minutes to get up to that temperature you're really going to get a lot of expression. This is true for Merlot, and it's also really true for Pinot Noir, because those wines just need to be warmed up a little bit to fully express themselves. They're kind of restrained at that cooler temperature. So you can just swirl this wine, maybe go ahead and warm it up with your hands. That's why we have a stem, right? Is so that we weren't warming up the Riesling, because it's meant to be that nice cellar temperature when you're drinking it. But for Merlot, I would recommend just kind of warming it up a little bit. So while you guys are warming up your wine, smelling your wine, which I'm like smelling blueberry tart like crazy right now, I'm going to go over to the chat box where I'm going to say hi to Special K. So this is Kelly and Special K's first time to Grape to Glass. Welcome, you guys. I hope you're enjoying it. It's really fun to have you here. I love having new faces. And Kelly Smith asked a great question. Now that I have these two bottles open, how long do I have to finish them? So that's a really good question with our white wines. You know, I always recommend about 3 to 5 days once you have them open. If you were going to take them to a tasting, I say like 2, 2.5, 3, just because you want people to taste them fresh. With the Riesling, because it ages well, I wouldn't be in a hurry to drink this right away. I would be totally fine putting the cork in, and that's probably what I'll do, and come back to it maybe on like Thursday or Friday. So you can do that too. It'll be fun for you because it's sort of when you have a wine open, and actually winemakers do this, where you just leave it open and see how it's going to age. Because you're kind of rapidly aging the wine. You're going to see what it's going to do in a couple years, in a couple days, because you're not going to have a cork in a perfectly tight sealed bottle. I don't gas my wines typically when I have them open, because I want to see what they're doing and what they're going to do in the cellar. So that's kind of fun. So I wouldn't be in a hurry with this particular wine, but whites in general, I would say, 2 to 3 days. And then on our Merlot, any reserve reds, I say you really have longer, more like 5 days, 5 to 7 days. And you can come back and taste that in a couple days and see how you like it. You might really like it in a couple days. And I expect that you will, because we expect this wine to age well for several years. But that's a really great question. And I do have some guidelines. In our training center, there's an introduction to wine course. And in that course, I actually have some general guidelines for each one of our collections on aging time and temperatures, and also after they've been opened, just sort of that window for best enjoyment. So you can always find those there. You can definitely keep your wines in the fridge if you've got room. I never do. But if you've got room in your fridge, you can keep the wines in there. I usually keep them on my counter, especially in the winter when it's not too warm. The worst thing would be if you live in a hot climate and it's summer and you're keeping them out there at 70 to 75, maybe probably going to be 75 to 80 in really warm climates. For a longer period of time, they're going to age really fast and you're going to lose a lot of the fruit. So if you have good temperature control, I'd say like 65 to 70 degrees on your countertop, you can leave them there. Otherwise, if it's warmer than that, you might want to keep them in the fridge. So looking at some of these descriptors, I think they help you identify some of the things that you're smelling in the wine. This has got kind of this dark roasted coffee, which actually comes from the oak aging regime. This wine is harvested and crushed and fermented and then aged in French oak for about 20 months. So you pick up some of these like mocha notes. We end up getting kind of a mocha chocolate note and that bittersweet chocolate. And that texture and richness is really pronounced and important in our reserve wines. It's what sets them apart from other wines, is that extra layer of richness and texture from our winemaking, and also from the quality of the grapes grown in Napa Valley. So you're going to get that velvety-like tannin. You can just imagine velvet and how that's different from silk or satin. It's very plush. Kind of weighted and dense. You never have like a thin velvet, right? It's usually kind of a thick velvet, and that's what reminds me of this wine. So this is going to be dry. There's absolutely no sugar in our reserve Napa Valley Merlot. So that's what that means. It is going to be balanced acidity, so not overly soft and not overly crisp. It's balanced acidity and typical found in red wine. And the body is going to be full body, that richness that comes from, again, the quality of the grapes, winemaking technique, and the barrel aging regime, which really fills out that profile. Oak barrels don't just add sort of an expression of spice, even though they're called the winemaker's spice rack a lot of the time, but they also have tannin themselves. So if you have ever sucked on a bag of tea, like Earl Grey black tea, and you can feel the tannin, that dryness, that component in the tea, that's the same kind of tannin that you find in an oak barrel. And when you first put the wine in the oak barrel, it's a little bit disjointed. It's like, whoa, what is that? But when you allow 20 months, the wine actually integrates with that tannin, and the tannin starts building the wine and filling it out. So you have those velvety tannins that are rich and round and supple and opulent, and make a really world-class wine after the aging is finished. Tasting this wine, I almost feel like you don't need food. Is anybody else there with me? It's so good just to sip alone. And I don't say that about all wines because I love food so much. But I really do think you can sip this wine making dinner, enjoying it with friends. This is kind of that perfect bottle to bring over to one of your friends' house when you're just like, let's hang out and talk. Have some wine. It's really round, it's rich, and it's standalone. But when I am pairing this, what do I look for? Um, well, I love mortadella. It's one of my favorite deli meats. And so I really recommend that. It's really an interesting meat, and it doesn't have too much of the characteristic like salami where it's not too oily. So the texture works. It's balanced with the Merlot, and you can find it almost anywhere. It can be expensive, but it also can be really affordable. So I like that when you're adding that to a cheese tray or charcuterie tray for a tasting event. And then roasted root vegetables are really my favorite. If you guys have seen this seasonal supplement, we pair this for Q1 with our, with Dan's recipe with the carrot and goat cheese and balsamic. That's this quarter, isn't it, Dan? Yeah, that's this quarter. So the new supplement has a really great recipe for roasted carrots. It's pretty inexpensive, and it is a finger food, so it's actually a great one for hosting as well, because you can just have those bite-sized pieces, and you're just using a couple long carrots and chopping them up, roasting them, adding a little bit of goat cheese and some balsamic. So that's also one of my favorites. This time of year, I do like the comfort food of roast beef and a red wine sauce too. And this is the perfect wine for that. Roast beef is not super fatty after you end up cooking it. And so you can really use a wine like this that's balanced and rich and full to pair with that, or maybe even like a roast beef stew of some kind. I made a beef stew the other night and really enjoyed Merlot with it. It was out of the Harry Potter cookbook, though. I'm just not going to lie. My son wanted me to cook the beef stew out of the Harry Potter cookbook, and it was actually a great pairing. And then if you want to do something fun for dessert, plum galette is my favorite. Anything with plums, but I'm just taking some of the tasting notes and using those in recipes because I like to use some of the tasting note flavors. So you could even take the blueberry tasting notes, you could take chocolate tasting notes. Anything you find in the tasting notes that you could create in your kitchen are going to pair really well with the wine, because like pairs just as well with like as do complementary flavors. So when you're in doubt and you want to do something fun, use some of those tasting notes. And plum isn't on this one particularly. I wonder if we don't really mention that one, but for me, Merlot, and especially this one, also has a lot of plum in it. It's really juicy and fleshy. So that's Merlot. I'm going to go back here and look at the chat box and see if you guys have any questions or comments about the Merlot. I know we're getting a little late, and I don't like to keep you guys too long, but this is a really great wine. I think sometimes people forget about it in the lineup of wines. It's a really great special wine if you just want to buy a bottle for a gift, but I really enjoy it too. Thanks, Tracy. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you guys in Napa. Thank you guys all for joining. I hope you learned something tonight about the wines. It was great tasting with you. I can pretend like you guys were actually here in my kitchen enjoying wines and tasting them with me. And I'll hopefully see all of you in Napa soon as our winery is scheduled to open in the second half of 2019. And we're really going to have a lot of fun. So I look forward to seeing you there. Until then, join me next month for Grape to Glass. And we're going to be tasting 2 more of Mari's picks for the quarter. All right, everybody. Cheers.